The paper said 376. That was the number of people the steamboat Sultana was licensed to carry. On the night of April the 27th, 1865, she was carrying more than 2,000. Almost all of them were soldiers going home. Most had just survived something that should have killed them already. They were former prisoners of war released in the final days of the conflict, walking skeletons out of the Confederate camps at Cahaba, in Alabama, in Andersonville, in Georgia. Andersonville had been the worst place in America. In 14 months, it killed nearly 13,000 men through starvation, exposure, and disease. The men now boarding the Sultana had lived through it. After years of captivity, they had one thing left to do: get on a boat and go north. The war was effectively over. Lee had surrendered weeks earlier. These men had survived the fighting, survived the camps, and survived the long walk to the river. Home was the last thing standing between them and the end of the war. For most of them, the river would be as far as they got. The Sultana was a good boat, 2 years old, 260 feet long, driven by 4 tubular boilers. She was rated to carry 376 people, and she had done honest work up and down the river for years. But when she reached Vicksburg, one of her boilers was leaking. The boat's chief engineer called in a local boilermaker, a man named R.G. Taylor. Taylor looked at the seam and told him the truth. 2 sheets of iron were bulged and had to be cut out and replaced. It was the only safe repair. The captain, James Cass Mason, did not have time for the only safe repair. Replacing the plates would take days, and days meant losing the contract. So Mason ordered a patch instead. Taylor riveted a single sheet of iron over the bulge, thinner than the plate it was covering. He warned that it was temporary and did the smaller job under protest. A steamboat boiler is a controlled bomb. It holds water under enormous heat and pressure, and every seam has to be sound. A thin patch over a weakened plate was a known risk to anyone who worked the river. Mason told Taylor it only had to hold to St. Louis. The boat left Vicksburg the same day, carrying the flaw north with her. To understand why the Sultana was so dangerously full, you have to look at a man who never set foot on the deck when she sank. His name was Reuben Hatch. He was the chief quartermaster at Vicksburg, and the government was paying steamboat operators to carry released prisoners north. $5 a man, 10 for an officer. Whoever loaded the most men made the most money. Hatch had a history. Early in the war as a quartermaster at Cairo, Illinois, he had been accused of taking bribes and falsifying accounts. The evidence was strong, but his brother was the Secretary of State of Illinois and a friend of President Lincoln, and the case against him quietly dissolved. In early 1865, a military board examined Hatch on the basic duties of his office and judged him totally unfit to perform them. 10 days later, he was made chief quartermaster at Vicksburg. At Vicksburg, the arrangement was simple and unspoken. Route the prisoners onto one boat, and there was money in it. 2 other steamboats sat at the landing that day, ready and able to share the load. Their captains wanted the men in the fees. They were left nearly empty, while the Sultana filled past reason. So the men kept coming aboard. Officers on the ground could see the boat was overloaded. Some protested. Captain Frederick Speed, the officer organizing the transfer from the parole camp, kept sending men down. The paperwork was rushed, the count was uncertain, and the pressure was to move the men fast and move them cheap. The crowding grew so severe that the crew had to prop up the middle deck with heavy timbers to keep it from collapsing under the weight of the men standing on it. No one stopped the loading. By the time the last of them squeezed on, the Sultana held roughly 2,100 people, nearly 6 times her legal capacity. She pushed north against the current, riding high and heavy, her patched boiler working harder than it was ever meant to. The Mississippi was in spring flood, a mile wide in places and running fast. On a boat that crowded and top-heavy, the hull rolled with the bends in the river. Every time she leaned, the water inside her boiler shifted and left the hot iron exposed. Exposed iron overheats. Overheated iron behind a thin patch is exactly where a boiler fails. None of the sleeping men knew any of this. Many had not slept safely in over a year. They slept where they could and let the boat carry them home. It was about 2 in the morning on April the 27th. The boat was roughly 7 miles above Memphis, near a cluster of low islands called the Hen and Chickens. Then 3 of her 4 boilers exploded. The blast tore the center out of the boat and threw scalding steam and splintered wood across the decks. Men who had survived years of war were killed in their sleep in an instant. One of the great smokestacks came down across the deck. The force flung people into the river and collapsed the decks in on the men below. What the explosion did not destroy, the fire finished. The Sultana was built of wood, and with her engines gone, she turned broadside to the current and burned to the waterline in the middle of the river. The men who were thrown clear or who jumped to escape the flames faced the second danger. The water. It was April and the river was high and cold. Most of the men could not swim, and the boat carried nowhere near enough life preservers. Many were still weak from prison. Some clung to wreckage until their hands failed. Others were pulled under by the current or by the crowd around them. The nearest help was miles downstream in Memphis, and it came slowly. The current carried burning wreckage and struggling men downstream toward Memphis in the dark. Other steamboats and the people of the city put out onto the water to pull men from the river. But by the time help reached the worst of it, the river had already done most of its work. Men were found clinging to the tops of trees on the flooded islands and drifting miles below the wreck, burned, half-drowned, and freezing. Many who were pulled out alive died in the days that followed. And here the record breaks apart, because no one ever agreed on how many died. The counts never matched. The United States Customs Service put the dead at 1,547. An early Army count by Colonel William Hoffman recorded 1,238. The War Department's own review in 1880 settled on 1,259. An 1867 military justice inquiry landed closer to 1,100. And the most exhaustive modern accounting published in 2022 arrives at 1,164. Every serious revision has moved the number down, not up. The figure near 1,800 that still appears on plaques and in headlines belongs to no official count. It is worth being precise about this because the exact number is the one thing the record will not give us, and inventing certainty where there is none would dishonor the men it counts. What is certain is narrower and no less staggering. Whatever the true figure, well over 1,000 people died, most of them soldiers who had already survived the war in the prison camps. More Americans died on the Sultana than would die on the Titanic half a century later. It remains the worst maritime disaster in American history, and almost no one noticed. 13 days earlier, Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. The day before the Sultana burned, his killer had been cornered and shot. The war was ending, the president was being mourned, and the death of over 1,000 soldiers on a river in Tennessee was pushed to the bottom of the page. The nation had run out of room to grieve. There were investigations. Frederick Speed, the man who kept sending soldiers down to the dock, was court-martialed for overloading the boat. He was found guilty. Then the judge advocate general of the Army reviewed the case and threw the conviction out, ruling that the responsibility had belonged to Reuben Hatch all along, and Reuben Hatch was never punished. He was summoned to testify and simply did not appear. His political connections held, as they always had. No one was convicted. No one served a sentence. The captain who ordered the patch had died in the explosion. The men who had loaded the boat for money walked away. The boilers were never redesigned because of the Sultana. No great law was passed in its name. The disaster did not reform the steamboat trade because the country was looking the other way when it happened. And by the time anyone looked back, the men who could have answered for it were beyond reach. The Sultana was preventable at every step. The bulged boiler that should have been replaced. The patch that was chosen because it was faster. The bribe that filled one boat instead of 4. The protests that were overruled. Every one of those was a decision, and every one of them was made by someone who survived. The number on the license was 376. What happened next was not an accident. It was the sum of what people already knew and chose to ignore. The Sultana was not the last time a survivable decision killed the people who trusted it. 46 years later, in a factory in New York, a door was locked to stop workers from stealing thread. When the fire started, 146 people could not get out. That decision, and who made it, is the next one worth understanding.